Yes, hello and welcome to Hanno Böck, who's talking about TLS.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, as you said, I'm going to talk about TLS today and focusing on attacks that we've seen against TLS in the past couple of years, and also a problem that I think doesn't get enough attention, which is the people implementing TLS but doing it in a wrong way. So a quick introduction about me. I, for one, work as a freelance journalist. I mostly write for the German news magazine Golem. And I also do Fuzzing, which I talked about yesterday, which is where I run a project that's funded by the Core Infrastructure Initiative from the Linux Foundation. And I write a monthly newsletter about TLS, which is the Bulletproof TLS Newsletter, which you can all and should all subscribe to. Then you get a monthly summary of all the important stuff that has happened around TLS. And I'm also occasionally trying to fix things in the TLS ecosystem, which sometimes turns out to be difficult. And yeah, that's what I try to talk about today. So I don't think I need to tell this to anyone here. TLS is very important because we basically use it all the time. Whenever we're doing a Google search or log into Facebook or check our emails, usually these days this happens encrypted over TLS. And this is just because this often causes some confusion. So what about the SSL versus TLS thing? So SSL is essentially just the old name of TLS. SSL was invented by Netscape in the 1990s, and it had two public versions. There was a version 2 and a version 3. The version 1 it was only like an internal thing, and then it was kind of moved over to being an official internet standard, and it was renamed to TLS. And unfortunately, the versioning is causing some confusion because we had SSL 2 and 3, and then the newer thing was called TLS 1.0 and 1.1 and 1.2. And soon we will have 1.3, although there's currently a discussion whether this should be called TLS 2.0 or maybe 4.0. So not entirely sure, but I will call it TLS 1.3 because up until the day before yesterday, that was what we thought we would call it. And also the colors here kind of indicate that all versions of the original SSL are insecure these days, so they have design security vulnerabilities that cannot be fixed. And TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are at least problematic. So the only thing you should really use these days is TLS 1.2. Then there have been a bunch of attacks in the past couple of years, and you probably all know this. These days, an attack usually goes with a catchy name, at least, and sometimes even with a logo. So this trend was mostly started with the so-called Beast attack, and I think the one that got most attention overall was Heartbleed, and like continued all over, and the latest one was called Sweet 32. Yeah. So, and this is an aspect that I find very interesting. Like for many of these attacks, almost all of them, you can find pretty old sources where this attack was already described, or at least a version of it was described. So if you take something like I don't know, the Drown attack, which is the so-called Bleichenbacher attack. The underlying attack was discovered in 1998, and one may wonder why do we still have a problem with an attack that was discovered that long ago? And this is true for many of these attacks. Yeah, so here's just a list, and I had actually more examples for that, but they didn't fit on the slide anymore. But we often see this, that we have a new attack, and it's basically just a new version of an attack that's been often more than 10 years old, or sometimes even like 20 years old. And I want to go through the history of one of these attacks, which has been especially persistent, and these are the so-called padding oracles. which the first description was by Sergey Vonny in 2002. And the background of this is TLS, up until recently, most TLS connections used something called CBC mode, which is a mode for block ciphers. And it combined it with an HMAC authentication tag. And because the CBC mode does the encryption and the HMAC does the authenticity, so it guarantees that nobody changes the data on the way. And the way that this is done in TLS is the so-called MAC then encrypt, or more precise MAC then pad and encrypt. So it first calculates the MAC and puts it after the plaintext. Then it pads it up to a certain block size, and then it encrypts it with CBC. And this turns out to be very problematic. And a quick look at this padding. So the way the padding looks like is actually quite simple. If it's 1 byte, then it's just a 0. If it's 2 bytes, then it's 2 1s. And if it's 3 bytes, then it's 3 2s. So it's always like 1 byte more than the number you have here. And then in the original TLS 1.1 and 1.0, there was the idea that if you get an error with the padding, you get one error message, and if you get an error with the MAC, you get another error message. So if the padding is somehow doesn't match, you get an error which is a decryption alert, and if the MAC fails, you get this bad record MAC error. This is CBC mode. Looks a bit complicated, but it actually isn't that complicated if you think like the main thing you need to understand here is that every ciphertext is XORed into the next block. So yeah. And how the attack works, so if you want to attack this, you just throw away the last block, because that always only contains padding, because the padding is always that long. For the block before, you can actually, by XORing, like in this block, you can try to XOR all the possible values. And at some point, this will end up being a 0 here. And a 0 is a valid padding. Therefore, once you brute force that through, you get the valid padding here, you have guessed 1 byte correctly, and you can decrypt 1 byte of this encryption. Is that kind of clear, or? And you end up, then you can basically do the same for the next byte and try a padding with 2 bytes, and for the next byte, and so on. And by that, with several connections, you can, like you need on average 128 connections for each byte to decrypt it. So that's bad. The attacker can decrypt data. And the first solution for this was that they said, okay, we have these different error messages, and these give the attacker information that the attacker can use to decrypt stuff. So we just change that and only send the same error message all the time. And the current TLS standard says the decryption failed error must not be sent. So this was in 2002. So we would assume everyone has fixed this by now. Like, for example, HP, they fixed it yesterday. I reported it to them sometime last year. I don't exactly remember, but yesterday I got an email that it was the first reaction to my report and that they fixed it now. On the other hand, Cisco, they are also vulnerable to this, and they never answered my emails, so it's probably not fixed. If you have a Cisco router, or if you're a customer of them, you might ask them about it. But then now we have this same error message, so the attacker cannot do this error message padding oracle anymore, but there's still a problem, because it takes a different time to just check the padding or to check the MAC. Because calculating the MAC involves some complicated crypto, and that just takes longer. Therefore, the attacker can just do all the same attack and just measuring how fast the server answers. And then he has this padding oracle attack all over again. So this was also tried to be fixed in TLS 1.2. So they propose a method how you change it in a way that it's always taking roughly the same time. But they already admit this leaves a small timing channel, but it is not believed to be large enough to be exploitable. And I want you now to remember that, because we will come back to that a few slides later. So TLS 1.2 says you should fix timing. They propose something, and then they tell you it doesn't really fix it, it only partly fixes it. Then a couple of years later, we also have, apart from TLS, another encrypted protocol which is quite important is SSH, and they do something different. They don't use MAC then encrypt, they use something called MAC and encrypt. So what they do is they calculate a MAC, and then they encrypt the plaintext and place the MAC outside. And it turned out that this is also very problematic, and there was an attack against it. And these days, these modes that have this vulnerability are no longer enabled by default in OpenSSH. But I think they still can be enabled, and some older implementations still use them. And there was also a very similar padding oracle attack against XML encryption, which, but it didn't use padding. It actually used errors based on ASCII codes. So it could kind of trick that sometimes the XML would validate and sometimes not, and thereby doing something very similar to a padding oracle attack. And then I told you should remember this small non-exploitable timing side channel. So as you may imagine, a couple of years later, someone showed that indeed it was exploitable, which was the so-called Lucky 13 attack. And this turned out to be a real mess, because like trying to fix the Lucky 13 attack, it's really hard. So, for example, Amazon, they wrote their own TLS implementation, and they implemented what they thought was a fix for the Lucky 13 attack, but then like the authors of the original Lucky 13 attacks had a look at it and said, no, this doesn't work, we can still attack it. Then there are some implementations that just chose to not try to fix it because it's too bothersome, and they just say, okay, use newer Cipher modes, we don't bother to fix this, it's just too annoying. For example, the Go TLS stack does this, and also the TLS stack from Hannes, the not quite so broken TLS he presented at this camp. As far as I'm aware, he also has not even attempted to fix this timing leak. And then earlier this year, Juraj Somorovsky found out that while trying to fix this Lucky 13 attack, OpenSSL has actually opened up another padding oracle attack that is more severe than the Lucky 13 attack. And if you look at the changelog from the latest OpenSSH version, you will see that they also apparently had some variant of the Lucky 13 attack that was fixed in the latest version. And a lot of this comes down to what Moxie Marlinspike has once described as the so-called cryptographic doom principle, where he says, if you have to perform any cryptographic operation before verifying the MAC on a message you've received, it will somehow inevitably lead to doom. So his idea here is that ideally the very first thing you should do if you get a cryptographic message is to check that it's correct. And if it's not correct, you don't try to do anything else with it, you just send an error and be done. So when all these attacks came up against CBC mode, especially Lucky 13, a lot of people said, okay, what can we do? Maybe we switch to some other encryption mode. And the only thing that was basically left in TLS was RC4. RC4, but it wasn't really the best idea, because it was already known at that time that RC4 had some weaknesses. So RC4 is, unlike CBC, it's not a block cipher, it's a stream cipher. And it turns out in the key stream of RC4, at some points there are some bits that are more likely than others. This was already known since 2000 at least. But then in 2013, after a lot of people have switched to RC4, a team consisting of Dan Bernstein, Kenny Patterson, and a couple of others, they were able to show that you can actually practically exploit these biases in TLS. And then over the last years, there were a lot of new papers that showed improvements to these attacks. So it's been improved again and again, and which in the end led to an RFC, which now says that the use of RC4 in TLS must not be done and should be forbidden. And the real solution for these problems is actually something called authenticated encryption. So the idea is basically, okay, we learned from many examples that when people try to combine encryption and authentication, they very often get it wrong, because there are like three main different ways to do it and only one is the right way. So the idea is, okay, then let's standardize what's called an authenticated encryption mode, which is like a standardized way to do both things together. And the most widely used is GCM, which stands for Galois Counter Mode. And the one that's recently gained a lot of traction is Poly 1305, which is usually used in combination with Cha-Cha-20, which are both constructions from DJB. This is something everyone who does anything with crypto, I'd like to tell them, you should just always use authenticated encryption. There's almost never a good reason not to use authenticated encryption. And a lot of attacks that we've seen in the past would have been avoided. Like, it's true for all these padding oracle attacks I told you. There was recently an attack on iMessage, which was because they were not using authenticated encryption. And I myself showed an attack on the OwnCloud encryption module. They didn't use any authentication at all. And in all those instances, just saying, okay, use an authenticated encryption mode would have prevented these attacks. Now, I was wondering a bit why aren't people using authenticated encryption modes, because we've known this for a long time, and it's not secret, and it's also not something very advanced. And then recently on some mailing list from CryptoParty, I think, someone posted a link to a crypto introduction material from a university. So it was a lecture, Cryptography 1 or something. And I looked into that and I said, I don't think this is very good because they don't teach people to use authenticated encryption. And what they were teaching were these 5 cipher modes. And I can go through them. ECB is basically not really a cipher mode. I always say it's more an example of what you should never do, because it's completely insecure and nobody should use it ever for anything. CBC is the one we heard about earlier in TLS, which led to all these padding oracle problems. CFB and OFB are a bit more obscure. I mean, I think GPG still uses some variant of it, but they are not in widespread use, and I don't see they are kind of a bit outdated. I don't see any reason to teach them today. Counter mode is it's in part what's underlying many modern ciphers, but by itself it's also not an authenticated encryption mode. Okay, so then I had a conversation with someone who apparently was a professor in computer science, who was doing crypto lectures, and I asked him what cipher modes he's teaching. And he told me these exact same 5 cipher modes. And then I did a Google search on computer science crypto introduction courses, and almost all of them teach these 5 cipher modes. And I wondered, okay, why is that? Is there some secret list that all the computer science people get which cipher modes they should teach? And actually there is this list, and it's in this book. It's Applied Cryptography from Bruce Schneier. Now, this is like the most famous book in cryptography, but there's a problem with it, and it's that it's from 1996. I mean, that's really a long time ago. And I mean, Bruce Schneier wrote a lot of right things in this book, but it's just not up to date. And he couldn't know about padding oracles because they were not invented yet. He couldn't know about authenticated encryption modes because there were no authenticated encryption modes in 1996. So, yeah. Maybe the universities should update their crypto materials, what they teach. Yeah. So take home that advice: you should always use authenticated encryption if you build crypto protocols, applications. But even authenticated encryption, that's not the end of the debate. There's currently a lot of discussions about how we could do better authenticated encryption modes. There's currently a competition running, which is a CISA competition for new authenticated encryption modes, and there's especially a debate about something called synthetic IVs, which I will get to now. Because, like, especially the GCM mode, by now most people have settled on using GCM, especially in TLS. But it's not uncontroversial. Many people say GCM is not a very good mode. It's hard to implement correctly. So, and an issue that I looked at earlier this year is the so-called Nonce in GCM. So Nonce stands for number used once. So it's relatively simple. You need some value to start your encryption, and this needs to be unique. So you should never use the same nonce value for two encryption operations with the same key. So the problem here is that the TLS standard doesn't tell you anything reasonable about how you choose this nonce. It says you could use the TLS record number, but you don't have to, and it doesn't tell you what's the secure way to choose a nonce and what is not. And it's quite simple to choose a nonce securely. You can just use a counter. You use 0 as the first nonce, and then you use 1, and then you use 2, and so on. It turned out some implementations get it wrong. And we found a couple of servers that were just sending duplicate nonces. Some of them were just always using 0. Some of them were, the first two values were the same and then were using a counter, and all kinds of stuff. We were able to identify 3 vendors, but for one of them it's not disclosed yet. The other 2 were Redware and Cavium. And we also found devices that were choosing the nonce at random, which is, it's not a very severe problem, but if you encrypt large amounts of data, it may become a problem. So, because then after if you're encrypting several gigabytes of data, you may get some risk that the nonce collides. Yeah, we've written a paper on this and also had a talk at Black Hat this year. Okay, next topic is deprecation. So when we find all these vulnerabilities, often in old protocol versions, we often want to say, okay, we now want to get rid of this really old stuff. And it turns out again and again that this is really hard. So we had the drown attack earlier this year, which was against SSL version 2. Now, SSL version 2 is like the oldest thing you can imagine in the TLS space. And already 2011, there was an RFC saying that you must disable SSL version 2, both on your server and your client. But despite that, the researchers who did the drown attack found out that 1/3 of the servers in the internet were vulnerable to their attack. The interesting thing there was that they could launch their attack even if the same key was used on another server with SSL2 enabled. So if you had a situation where you had a web server that had SSL2 disabled, but you had a mail server with the same certificate, you could use that mail server to attack the web server. But anyway, the point I want to make here is that, yeah, we tried to say forbid SSL version 2, and it turns out many people didn't follow that advice. After the so-called Logjam attack, Chrome decided to disable Diffie-Hellman key exchanges with very small groups. Because but it's long been known that this would be weak, and it was basically a security problem of Chrome that they didn't do this earlier. And you can find a thread in the Chrome forums about that, where many users were really angry about this, because here one user is saying, this error is preventing me from opening the login page on my Cisco RV042G router. And others were a bit more aggressive, like saying, do I have to dump Chrome? I need to get to my routers and can't. There's no way to update the SSL on my routers. This is ridiculous. We had to use Internet Explorer to access a very secure website. So people were really outraged that Chrome was improving security by disallowing these insecure encryption variants. So on the page before we had this Cisco router. Now this Cisco router was released in 2012, and RSA with 412 bits, which is similar to the security of RSA and Diffie-Hellman, is basically the same with the same size. So RSA 512 was broken in 1999. So since 1999, it was basically obvious that these small Diffie-Hellman groups are a security risk and shouldn't be used. And still Cisco, 13 years later, published a new product that's only supporting these small Diffie-Hellman groups. And things like this happen all the time. So in 2010, Nokia and Microsoft produced the Lumia 800 phone, which was at that time a really expensive phone. So it was kind of high-end class. And it had a mail client that only supports SSL version 3. TLS 1.0, which is a successor to SSL version 3, was published in 1999, so 11 years earlier. And then the Poodle attack came, and Poodle was an attack against SSL version 3, so many people disabled SSL version 3. And it turns out, okay, people with that phone could not use email anymore because their mail servers were disabling SSL version 3. The problem here is, why does Microsoft in 2010 publish a product which has completely outdated TLS stack? And something basically the same happened with Fritzbox devices from AVM, which is mostly used in Germany. And the same thing is happening again and again. So right now, we basically know that due to all these padding oracles, that TLS 1.0 and 1.1, we may want to get rid of them at some point. But there's a lot of stuff out there, including, for example, Apple Mail, that doesn't support anything newer than TLS 1.0. So we may get the same discussion again in a couple of years when we want to deprecate TLS 1.0. So what I want to ask here is, why is it acceptable that products, and especially often high-end products, very expensive products, come with substandard crypto shipped? And I don't have a good answer to that. And now I want to get to TLS implementation bugs. And this is one which kind of has a long history. In 2008, I opened this bug in the Mozilla bug tracker, where I discovered that I was using a server with various websites with different certificates, and I experienced sometimes, especially with bad internet connections, the server would show me the wrong certificate. And why was that happening? So that needs a bit of background. You need to understand how the TLS handshake works. So the TLS handshake, basically, the server and the client need to agree on some version of TLS they both support. So what's happening is that the client sends the so-called client hello message and says, yeah, dear server, the maximum TLS version I support is TLS 1.2. And then maybe the server doesn't support that yet because it's an older server, and the correct way to do then is it sends back a server hello with a lower version number. So it might say, okay, I don't support TLS 1.2, I support TLS 1.0, and then it sends back a server hello, and in case both support that, then they can make a connection. However, what often happens is that if you send a client hello to a server with the version it doesn't support, then it will just not know what to do with it and may send an error message, or it may terminate the connection, or it may crash and produce a timeout. And this is called version intolerance. And this is always a bug in the server. So this is not correct behavior, but it's very widespread. And this slide doesn't belong there. Sorry. What the browsers did over the years is that they said, okay, we need to handle this somehow. When we introduce new TLS versions, we cannot break 10% of the internet. So they implemented a fallback. So they say, okay, if our connection with TLS 1.2 fails, we will try it again with TLS 1.1. And then we will try it again with TLS 1.0. And then we will try it again with SSL version 3. And we will just try all the versions we support, which sometimes has been called a protocol dance. I think this term was coined in the Poodle attack paper. Then in 2014, Antoine de Lenat-Lavaux presented an attack which was called the virtual host confusion attack. And this attack actually exploited this browser behavior, because it was an attack that needed a connection with SSL version 3, and which kind of also gets back to the bug I reported earlier. So, and an attacker can just trigger these fallbacks, because if you block a connection with TLS 1.2, then the browser will fall back. And if you block the next connection until it's an SSL version 3 connection, you can force the browser to use this older version. And then later that year, the Poodle attack came, and this really made this a big issue, because it was an attack against SSL version 3, which nobody was supposed to use anymore. But due to using these downgrade attacks, you could force people into using this old attack. And going back to the bug I showed you earlier, what was happening there was actually that sometimes with the bad internet connections, these fallbacks were triggered just because the connection failed due to a bad connection. And if you're using different certificates on one server, you're using a technology called SNI, and that was not available in SSL version 3. So if a downgrade happens, then you see the wrong certificate, because this technology to support different certificates doesn't work anymore. So what then happened was that there was a proposal to implement something called SCSV, where the server can tell the browser that, okay, hello, I'm not broken, please don't do these downgrades. So what we have here is we have a version negotiation mechanism that works if it's correctly implemented. Then several servers implement it in the wrong way. Then the browsers implement a workaround for it. Then we learn that this workaround introduces a security issue. So we need another workaround for the security issue introduced by a workaround for a broken device. So that's kind of the situation we're often in the TLS ecosystem. So yeah, we've known this issue since at least 2003. There's a document at Mozilla which basically describes it in relatively detail, which talks about like Netscape versions and Mozilla 0.9 and where this already was a problem. But these days, the browsers have removed these downgrades because after Poodle, many stuff got fixed. But now we will have TLS 1.3 in a couple of months, and all this is going to start again. So Adam Langley, he's a Google developer, recently wrote a blog post. Yeah, it has taken about 15 years to get to the point where web browsers don't have to work around broken version negotiation. When we try to add a fourth TLS 1.3 in the next year, we'll have to add back the workaround, no doubt. So developer of one of the main browsers says, there's no question we will have to do this all again, although we know that it's kind of stupid. And I tried to follow that up a bit, and I did some scans who has this problem. And I was able to identify a couple of vendors, but I was not very happy with their reactions. So I found out, okay, IBM HTTP server had this problem. They told me, yeah, at some point they understood the problem. At first they said they don't think they have this problem, and they had some difficulty understanding it. But then at some point they understood it and told me, okay, that they expect by the end of the year they may fix it because it's too late for the next release. I tried to explain them that this is an urgent issue because TLS 1.3 is going to get shipped, but they didn't answer on that. Citrix, they apparently already knew about this issue, but they haven't told me anything. I've asked them like for a time frame when they will fix it, and they haven't answered on that. And Cisco, it turned out that these were mostly devices that are out of support, so they will probably never get an update, but there are still a lot of these devices out in the internet. And I also asked some website operators from popular websites that currently have this problem. The top one was Apple. They didn't answer. PayPal told me that SSL issues are not part of their bug bounty program. Then I asked them, yeah, okay, but I don't want a bug bounty. I just want you to fix this. And they didn't answer on that. And eBay didn't answer at all. So that's was kind of the reaction of top website operators. This was not the only issue of that kind. So a couple of years ago, we had a problem that some F5 load balancers, they actually terminated the connection if you tried to do a handshake which was larger than 256 bytes, but smaller than 512 bytes. So there was like a window in which the size of the handshake would cause the server to not work correctly. So what could you do? You could just fill up your handshake with some garbage, which was done as a padding extension for the handshake. Now, maybe you can guess what happened next. So what happened next was that we found out, okay, but there are other TLS implementations that break if you send a handshake larger than 512 bytes. So you can pad it, and then these F5 devices no longer break, but then some Cisco device breaks. The good thing about this was the Cisco device was for email, and the other thing was for HTTPS. So you could kind of, if you only pad HTTPS, then you kind of work around most broken devices. There are other things that happen. Like you can basically almost try to imagine everything you could get wrong in a TLS stack, and you will find someone who gets it wrong. So we were talking about Poodle earlier. Poodle was an attack that relied on the fact that the padding in SSL version 3 was not defined in the specification. And in TLS 1.0, the specification says how you should do the padding. But some implementations just didn't check for that. So they were vulnerable to the Poodle attack, although they were not using SSL version 3. And then it turned out that there are also implementations that only checked a part of the padding and missed some bytes. Some were only checking the last byte, and some were missing like the first byte or the first 2 bytes. The GNU TLS one I actually figured out, and that was interesting because this bug was already found by the authors of the Lucky 13 paper, but like the original bug was that it missed to check 2 bytes, and then it was changed to miss only 1 byte. So yeah. Then there were a couple of implementations that simply didn't check the MAC, so they had no authenticity for the connection. Vulnerable there were F5, Cisco, and Fortinet, and some didn't check the so-called finished message, which is something that's there to protect the integrity of the handshake. Then there was a very interesting paper by Florian Weimer. So if you're doing an RSA signature, what you usually do is that you're splitting the calculation up into 2 smaller calculations, because RSA is operating with the product of 2 primes, and you can use, if you know the 2 primes, you can do this faster by splitting it up into two But there's a problem with that if one of these calculations produces a wrong result, then if you still then by seeing the signature, you can calculate the private key. Therefore, if there's any hardware flaw or software bug that occasionally produces wrong results, this may leak a private key. And there were all kinds of devices vulnerable to this, from Citrix, Hillstone, Syxel, Radware, with a Cavium chip. You may notice that some of these company names show up more often on my slides. That may tell you something. And all these stories have made me come to the conclusion that almost every imaginable TLS implementation flaw can be found in the wild. So if you want to write a nice paper about TLS, what I recommend to you would be look into the TLS standard and see if you can find things that you think people could miss or people could get wrong. And then try to find a way how you can test for this, and then scan the internet and you will find vulnerable implementations. I can guarantee you that. Yeah. So I think one problem is that we don't really have very good tests for these kinds of problems. So we don't have anything like a TLS Test Suite where I could say, just run this test suite against the server and show me if it behaves correctly. And especially for negative tests, like I send something with a defect padding, does it still try to connect with me? Or what kind of error message does it send? Is the error message the correct one? All these kinds of things. And there are some projects right now trying this. I think Hannes is also trying it. Yeah, and there's like a Red Hat developer who is currently developing a project called TLS Fuzzer, which goes into that direction. So I have some hope that this may improve in the future and we have better test tools. How much time do I have?
We have 15 minutes.
Okay, then I'll add the optional slides. Okay, so in the past couple of years, we had some kind of trend that the web especially is going to TLS by default. And some large players, mostly Google, but also Mozilla and Let's Encrypt, have tried to push for HTTPS by default. And I think this is generally a very good thing. Even despite all those vulnerabilities, it's still better to encrypt than not to encrypt. But there's a surprising amount of pushback against this idea of default HTTPS. And I think most of it is grounded because people don't really understand what HTTPS does. So the most popular thing is probably that people say, I don't need HTTPS for my blog because there's nothing secret on my blog. Everyone can see it. Everyone can read it. But that fails to understand what HTTPS actually is about. So HTTPS is encryption, but it's also authentication. So it means you get a guarantee that what the server sends you is really the data you get. And here's an example from the local supermarket here. When I came here on the ferry, like we went to the supermarket and they have free Wi-Fi. And if you go on their Wi-Fi, they inject a banner into the websites you're surfing to. So this is actually happening, that people running Wi-Fis, they inject content into the web pages you're surfing to. And with HTTPS, this is just not possible because the content is authenticated. Then there's the idea, okay, we might use HTTPS, but only for the part of the web page that's transmitting important data. Especially people say, okay, we will encrypt the login, but not the web page itself. This picture here is GMX, which is like the biggest German email provider, and that's exactly what they are doing. They have an unencrypted web page, and you log into that. The problem here is the attacker can change the login form. So it's transmitted unencrypted and unprotected, so the attacker can just change the target of the login, so it sends your username and password to someone else, and then it could forward you back to the real login and you wouldn't notice. This is called an SSL stripping attack. It's been presented by Moxie Marlinspike, I think in 2009. And then there's the issue of performance when people say, okay, but if I run TLS, then my server will overheat and the CPU will spike all the time. And this is grounded that people have wrong ideas how expensive crypto is in computational costs. So actually, TLS is relatively cheap when it comes to computational costs, especially if you use something reasonably current. And if you do something like running a PHP page, then you simply won't notice the additional performance cost of HTTPS. And also, if you're using HTTP2, then you can even get better performance by using TLS because HTTP2 is not available without TLS, at least in practice. And this I find the hardest to debate because it is in part true. And that is that people say yeah, certificate authorities that give out the TLS certificates, they are all corrupt, they cannot be trusted, therefore we should not use TLS. And these problems are real. I mean, just this week there was a new incident with the Chinese authority Vosign that apparently issued a certificate for GitHub to someone else who was not GitHub, and all the time we can read stories about certificate authorities getting things wrong. But what people fail to recognize is that in the past years, the situation has improved a lot. And one of the developments is that we now have something called the baseline requirements, which is just a written down set of rules how CAs have to operate. And we didn't have that before. So right now, I mean, they are not ideal yet. There's a lot that could be improved, but at least we have some kind of guidelines how these should operate. And also we have new technologies that make it harder to exploit this issue. And one of them is HTTP public key pinning, which is where a web page can tell the browser, okay, this is my key and this is my backup key, and please save them. And if someone shows you this web page with a different key, then something is wrong, and then you should send an alert and not serve to that web page. So this kind of adds an additional trust on first use mechanism to HTTPS. But a warning, a lot of people try to implement it and don't really understand what they are doing. And this has the potential that you can lock yourself out of your own web page. Because if you pin to a key and then lose the key and also lose your backup key, then there's nothing you can do anymore. Your site will be inaccessible for at least a couple of months. So this is a good technology, but only if you really understand it very well, you should implement it. And then there's certificate transparency, which is the idea that we have some public logs where all the certificates are logged. And right now this is only implemented in parts, but I think it's still already very useful. So a lot of these incidents we have these days with certificate authorities, they get uncovered because there are these logs and everyone can see what's going on, which certificates are issued. And you can yourself look into these logs if there are certificates for your domain that you don't know about. And then you know something is really strange and wrong. And there was a major incident with Symantec last year, which was uncovered due to these certificate transparency logs. So I think this is really a very good step in the right direction. So the biggest problem actually people who want to migrate to HTTPS and can't have is third-party content, and especially ads. So I told you earlier that I work for this German IT news webpage, and they don't use HTTPS. And the reason is that they have an ad network that does not support HTTPS. And ad networks are especially complicated because it's often a whole chain of actors. So you're including something from your ad network, and they have other ad networks that are delivering their banners, and then they fetch the banner from the real ad customer. So I think this is the biggest stopper when people try to migrate to HTTPS. And this is also why you see that a lot of media pages don't migrate to HTTPS, although they should. Yeah, so in the future, the next big thing will be TLS 1.3, or maybe it will be TLS 2.0 or 4.0, that's currently discussed. But TLS 1.3 will deprecate a whole lot of problematic crypto constructions. So one is the RSA handshake, which doesn't mean they will deprecate RSA, but if you're using RSA without an additional key exchange, that will be deprecated. So all the Cipher modes in TLS 1.3 will have what's called forward secrecy, and they will avoid these Bleichenbacher attacks, which were, for example, a reason for the Drown attack. Then there will be no more unauthenticated encryption modes. The CBC HMAC combination, which was so problematic due to these padding oracles, will be gone. Then also the old RSA modes will be deprecated. So RSA there's a version PKCS 1.5, which is kind of the original RSA standard, or the one that most people are using today, and they will move to something newer, which is called PSS, and which has some much better security properties. And also all the weak hash functions that are still part of the standard will be deprecated. Yeah. So, but still some problems remain. So as I said earlier, version intolerance and other compatibility issues, we will see them again with TLS 1.3. And also sometimes cross-protocol attacks can keep old weaknesses. So even if you have TLS 1.3, which disables some stuff, if you still support older versions, this may enable attacks on that level. And there's been an interesting paper about Bleichenbacher attacks about that last year. Yeah, conclusions. So TLS is becoming the default, and that's a good thing. You should all support that. If you have a web page or if you're responsible for a web page, please deliver HTTPS. We see very old attacks coming back, which means we're not really fixing them in a proper way. Implementation bugs like version intolerance introduce a security risk, and they also often introduce a security risk not only for themselves but also for the ecosystem as a whole. I'd say try avoid re-implementing TLS. Hannes is an exception. I trust him that he can do it. But because what we very often see is that enterprise vendors ship their own TLS stack, and then we have all these broken implementations. And it's usually better to just use OpenSSL, because you can say a lot of bad things about OpenSSL, but at least these days they tend to get the basics right. And I think we need better testing tools. So yeah. Yeah, then thanks for listening, and do you have questions? Yeah.
You mentioned 512-bit and 768-bit was broken. And
Yeah.
how strong would you recommend today? Because I have a client who does some Java application, cannot use 4K RSA. So how strong would you recommend today?
Yeah. So the question was like how strong I would recommend for RSA, and RSA was the issue. So I mean 2048 is probably strong enough, because that will only get broken, very likely only get broken by quantum computers, and if you have a quantum computer then everything's broken that we use today. So unfortunately, the thing is, I could have added more slides. I could have talked about post-quantum cryptography and things like that. It's also very interesting, but yeah. But I'm aware of these Java client problems, so the Java TLS stack is not very good.
No more questions?
Yeah.
Six, and addition to the first one, what about going beyond the 4K?
The question was, what about going beyond 4K? So it gets really slow when you get to 8K, and it doesn't really. So I think if you think 4K is not good enough in security for you, then you should not look at larger keys. You should look at post-quantum cryptography. Because the only realistic risk for RSA with large key sizes are quantum computers. And you don't protect a lot against them with larger keys. You want to use post-quantum cryptography. But that's kind of a, yeah.
Unless you have like 60 megabytes.
Yeah, but then you can use like make a lease with a 1 megabyte key, and you will be probably much safer.
I mean, like people worry about key sizes all the time, but it's actually better use of time to spend like reading the protocol and seeing if the source code matches it. That's what most of the
Yeah. So I can support what he just said. So I think this key size debate gets too much attention. So there's a lot more to a secure crypto protocol than the key size. And your most likely problem is implementation bugs, and your next most likely problem is bad crypto constructions. And the key size is, unless you're using very old stuff, the least likely to be your problem. Okay. And thanks.